The Wendigos of Willow Lake. The old man sat heavily on his weathered porch, the ancient boards creaking under his weight. His face was lined and careworn, a roadmap of a hard life etched into his leathery skin. He took a long, contemplative drag from his hand-rolled cigarette, the glowing ember casting a faint, eerie light in the gathering dusk. "You sure you want to hear this story?" he asked, his voice a rasping whisper, as if he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "It's not a tale for the faint of heart. It'll burrow into your mind and nest there, haunting your dreams and making you question the very nature of the world around you." The young journalist leaned forward, her eyes wide and eager, a notebook and pen poised in her hands. She had chased this story for months, following the trail of whispered rumors and faded newspaper clippings to this remote cabin in the woods. "Yes," she breathed, "I want to know everything about the disappearances at Willow Lake. The world needs to know what happened to those poor kids." The old man sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades of sorrow and regret. He took another long pull from his cigarette, the smoke curling from his nostrils like a dragon's breath. "Very well," he said at last, "but don't say I didn't warn you. Some knowledge comes at a terrible price." He settled back in his chair, his eyes growing distant as he began to speak, his words painting a vivid picture of a nightmare come to life. The sun was just beginning to dip below the tree line as the two cars pulled up to the rustic cabin nestled on the shore of Willow Lake. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and the chirping of crickets, a symphony of nature that seemed to welcome the newcomers to this peaceful retreat. Emma was the first to emerge, her blonde hair gleaming in the fading light. She stretched languidly, a smile playing at the corners of her lips as she breathed in the fresh, clean air. "We made it," she exclaimed, turning to grin at her companions. "Can you believe it? A whole weekend away from the rest of the world. Just us and this gorgeous lake." Liam, her boyfriend and the star quarterback of their high school football team, came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "It's perfect," he agreed, nuzzling her neck affectionately. "No parents, no rules, no responsibilities. Just good friends and good times." Aiden, Liam's best friend and the self-appointed class clown, bounded out of the second car, a mischievous grin on his face. "And no supervision," he added with a wink. "Which means we can get up to all sorts of trouble." Olivia, Aiden's girlfriend and a talented artist, rolled her eyes as she climbed out of the passenger seat. "Is that all you ever think about?" she asked, but there was a fond smile on her face as she said it. Sophie and Ethan, the final two members of their group and inseparable best friends since childhood, emerged from Ethan's car, stretching out the kinks from the long drive. Sophie's eyes were immediately drawn to the dense forest that surrounded the cabin, a strange unease settling in the pit of her stomach. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" she asked softly, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. Ethan bumped her shoulder with his own, a reassuring smile on his face. "It's just the woods, Soph," he said. "We're not used to being so far from the city. That's all. It's going to be an amazing weekend. You'll see." As the friends unpacked their cars and hauled their bags into the cozy cabin, none of them noticed the pair of eyes that watched from the shadows of the trees, a predatory gaze that followed their every move with a terrible, hungry intensity. The first night passed in a blur of laughter, good food and even better company. They swam in the cool, clear waters of Willow Lake until their fingers pruned and their muscles ached, splashing and dunking each other like carefree children. As the sun began to set, they gathered around a crackling campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows and trading scary stories that made them clutch each other and shriek with gleeful terror. It was late by the time they finally stumbled off to bed. Exhausted but happy, the couples claimed the cozy bedrooms, while Sophie and Ethan stretched out on opposite ends of the plush couch in the main room. Sophie drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sound of Ethan's breathing and the distant hooting of an owl. But her rest was far from peaceful. She found herself running through a dark, twisted forest, branches tearing at her hair and clothes like grasping fingers. Her lungs burned and her legs ached. But she couldn't stop, driven by a blind, primal terror that nipped at her heels like a ravenous beast. And then, through the trees ahead, she saw a figure, tall and gaunt, with antlers that reached towards the moonless sky like gnarled, skeletal hands. It turned towards her, its face a nightmare of sunken eyes and jagged teeth, a predatory grin stretching its thin, bloodless lips. Sophie tried to scream, but no sound escaped her constricted throat. The creature took a step towards her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette dancing on tangled strings. It opened its mouth, a black void that seemed to swallow the very light around it, and let out a shriek that pierced Sophie's skull like an icy dagger. She jolted awake with a gasp, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to her mind like cobwebs. And then she heard it, a long, mournful howl that sent shivers racing down her spine. It sounded close, far too close for comfort. With trembling hands, she fumbled for her phone, switching on the flashlight and aiming it towards the window with a sense of mounting dread. A face stared back at her, illuminated in the harsh white beam, gaunt and skeletal, with sunken eyes that glittered with a malevolent hunger, and antlers that protruded from its skull like a crown of thorns. Sophie's scream caught in her throat as the creature bared its jagged teeth in a grin that was all too familiar. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Sophie's scream finally tore free, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that shattered the peaceful night and brought the others stumbling from their rooms, bleary-eyed and confused, as she recounted what she had seen. Her voice shaking and her eyes wild, most of the group exchanged skeptical glances. A nightmare, they assured her, brought on by too many scary stories and an overactive imagination. But Olivia was pale, her hands clutched together so tightly that her knuckles shone white in the dim light. "I've read about this," she whispered, her voice trembling, "in the old legends of the tribes that used to live in these woods. They spoke of creatures called wendigos, evil spirits that could possess humans and turn them into monsters. Twisted things that craved human flesh above all else." A heavy silence fell over the group as they absorbed her words, a palpable sense of unease settling over them like a shroud. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending branches scraping against the walls of the cabin like clawed fingers seeking entry. No one slept well that night, huddled together in the main room as if there was safety in numbers. As the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the trees, Aiden was the first to break the tense silence. "We should leave," he said, his usually jovial face uncharacteristically somber. "I don't know what's out there, but I don't want to stick around to find out." But when they ventured outside, they found Ethan's car utterly destroyed, the engine torn apart as if by some immensely strong savage force. Pools of oil and other fluids soaked into the dirt, the acrid scent hanging heavy in the air. Liam's car was no better, the doors hanging off their hinges and the tires slashed to ribbons. It was as if something had intentionally sabotaged their means of escape. And then, with a sinking sense of dread, they realized that none of their phones had a signal. They were well and truly stranded, cut off from the outside world with no way to call for help. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the friends huddled together, a rising sense of panic settling over them like a physical weight. They were trapped, at the mercy of whatever lurked in the shadows of the forest. And deep in those woods, ancient and hungry eyes watched, and waited, and hungered. The day wore on, the sun beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The friends tried to keep busy, to distract themselves from the growing sense of dread that hung over the cabin like a pall. They searched for tools to repair the cars, for any spot where they might be able to get a cell signal. But it was as if the forest itself was against them, the trees pressing in close and dense, disorienting them until they found themselves walking in circles, always ending up back at the cabin no matter which direction they set out in. As the shadows began to lengthen, they made the decision to split up, to cover more ground before the light faded entirely. Liam and Emma headed towards the lake shore, while Aiden and Olivia ventured into the woods, following a narrow, overgrown trail that snaked between the trees. Sophie and Ethan struck out in the opposite direction, picking their way through the undergrowth towards a rocky outcropping that rose above the tree line. If they could get to higher ground, they reasoned, they might be able to spot a landmark or even a distant cell tower. They had barely made it 100 yards from the cabin when a blood-curdling scream rent the air, a sound of such primal terror and agony that it made their blood run cold in their veins. They raced back the way they had come, hearts pounding and lungs burning, dreading what they might find but driven by a desperate need to help their friends. They found Olivia first, sprawled across the forest floor like a broken doll. Her throat had been torn out, ragged flesh and glistening bone visible through the gaping wound. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the canopy above, wide and glassy with a final, eternal horror. Of Aiden there was no sign, only a trail of blood smeared across the leaves and the tree trunks. as if he had been dragged away by some immense, terrifying force. Numb with shock and horror, Sophie and Ethan fled back to the cabin, desperate for the illusion of safety that its walls might provide. But when they burst through the door, they found only more devastation. Furniture was overturned, cushions and curtains shredded as if by claws. And there, in the center of the main room, lay the ravaged bodies of Emma and Liam. They had been eviscerated, their chests cracked open and their organs strewn across the floor like macabre confetti. Blood painted the walls and pooled on the wooden floorboards. An abstract masterpiece of violence and savagery. Sophie felt bile rise in her throat, her stomach heaving with revulsion. Beside her, Ethan made a choked, disbelieving sound, his face drained of all color. And then, from outside, came a sound that froze the marrow in their bones, a low, guttural growl like a predator that had scented prey. They ran, blind with terror, crashing through the undergrowth with no heed for direction or destination. Branches whipped at their faces and snagged at their clothes. But they barely felt the sting, driven by a primal need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horror that lurked behind them. And all the while, the growls and snarls grew closer. A relentless pursuit that seemed to come from all sides at once. As if the very forest had come alive with malevolent, hungry intent. They ran until their lungs screamed for air and their legs trembled with exhaustion. Until they burst from the tree line onto the rocky shore of the lake, the water lapping at the stones like a black, oily tongue. And there, at the end of a small, rickety dock, they saw their salvation, a weathered old boathouse. Its wooden walls gray and warped with age and neglect. They sprinted for it, leaping over the gaping holes in the dock, the rotten boards creaking and groaning beneath their feet. They flung themselves through the door, slamming it shut behind them and jamming the bolt home with trembling hands. And then they collapsed, chests heaving and bodies shaking with adrenaline and terror, as the reality of their situation crashed over them like a tidal wave. Their friends were dead, torn apart by some nightmarish creature that defied all rational explanation. And they were trapped, hunted, with no way to call for help and no hope of escape. Outside, the shadows lengthened and the light began to fade, and the growls and snarls grew closer, a symphony of hunger and malice that promised a long, terrifying night ahead. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity of fear and dread. Sophie and Ethan huddled together in the center of the boathouse, flinching at every creak of the old wooden walls, every lap of the water against the pilings. They took turns keeping watch, peering out through the gaps in the weathered boards, straining their eyes to catch any hint of movement in the gathering gloom. But the night beyond was an impenetrable wall of darkness, broken only by the faint, silvery gleam of the moon on the lake's surface. As the long, tense hours wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. Sophie felt her eyelids growing heavy, her head nodding forward despite her best efforts to stay awake. Beside her, Ethan's breathing had slowed and deepened, his body slumping against hers as he drifted into a fitful doze. She had nearly succumbed to sleep herself when a sound jolted her back to full, heart-pounding alertness, a soft, deliberate scratching, like claws on wood coming from the outer wall of the boathouse. Sophie clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle the whimper that tried to escape her throat. Beside her, Ethan stirred, his eyes snapping open, wide and haunted in the gloom. They listened, hardly daring to breathe, as the scratching sound circled the boathouse, slow and methodical, as if the creature outside was testing for weaknesses, seeking a way in. And then, with a suddenness that made them both jump, a gnarled, clawed hand punched through the rotting wood, showering them with splinters and dust. Ethan leapt to his feet, snatching up a rusted machete from a nearby shelf. He swung wildly at the appendage, the blade biting deep into the mottled, leathery flesh. Blackened blood sprayed across the floor and walls, and a shrill, inhuman shriek split the air, a sound of rage and pain that made their teeth ache in their skulls. The hand retreated, leaving a jagged hole in the wall. But the reprieve was short-lived. Almost immediately, the entire structure began to shudder and groan as if caught in the grip of some tremendous force, the walls bulging inward and the boards splintering under a barrage of ferocious blows. "We can't stay here," Ethan shouted over the cacophony of shattering wood. "We have to make a run for it." He seized Sophie's hand, pulling her roughly to her feet. Together, they kicked open the door on the opposite side of the boathouse, the one that faced out over the water. They plunged into the inky shallows, gasping at the shock of the cold water. Behind them, the boathouse collapsed inward with a deafening crash. reduced to a pile of kindling in a matter of seconds. An enraged bellow shattered the night, and Sophie risked a glance over her shoulder as they waded deeper into the lake. The horned figure of the Wendigo loomed out of the darkness, its emaciated form splashing into the shallows in pursuit, moving with a speed and grace that belied its gaunt, skeletal frame. Panic lent them strength, and they struck out for the far shore, their arms and legs churning through the water with a desperate, fumbling urgency. The lake seemed to go on forever, a vast black expanse that threatened to swallow them whole. Sophie's lungs burned with the effort of swimming, her muscles screaming in protest with each frantic stroke. The Wendigo was closing in behind them, its grasping breaths and inhuman snarls now audible over the slap of the water against their bodies. A foul stench reached her nostrils like rancid meat left to rot in the summer sun. She chanced another glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. In the ghostly light of the rising moon, she could make out the Wendigo's twisted, emaciated form, its bone-thin limbs propelling it through the water with unnatural speed and agility. Its face was a nightmarish visage of sunken eyes and jagged teeth, set in a perpetual, hungry, riotous grin, and jutting from its skull was a crown of antlers, twisted and gnarled like the branches of a dead tree, reaching hungrily towards the sky. A malicious hiss sounded behind them, startlingly close, and then a white-hot lance of pain shot through Sophie's right calf. She cried out, her voice raw with terror, as one of the creature's gnarled claws raked across the back of her leg, opening a deep, ragged gash beside her. Ethan's eyes went wide at the sight of her blood blossoming in the water like a crimson cloud. He grabbed her arm, his strong strokes propelling them both forward with renewed desperation. "Keep going," he shouted hoarsely. "We're almost there." Sophie grit her teeth against the searing pain, kicking with her good leg and using her arms to pull herself through the water. She could feel the creature's hot, rancid breath on the back of her neck, could almost taste the hunger and malice that radiated from it in waves. Ethan was right, the shoreline loomed ahead, tantalizingly close. With a final bone-weary burst of effort, they dragged themselves onto the muddy bank, half crawling, half scrambling up the incline towards the tree line. Just a few more yards, Sophie told herself, her chest heaving with exertion. A few more yards, and they would be back in the cover of the forest, where perhaps they could lose their monstrous pursuer. But as they crested the rise, their hopes were crushed by the sight that met them. There, emerging from the gnarled trunks and tangled underbrush, was a second towering figure, its antlered silhouette unmistakable even in the dim moonlight. They were trapped between the two Wendigos, one dripping and feral in front of them, the other prowling up the shoreline behind, cutting off any hope of retreat or escape. The two friends came to a halt, their shoulders slumping in despair. Sophie felt the fight go out of her, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a strange, morbid acceptance of their fate. She reached for Ethan's hand, gripping it tightly enough to grind the bones together. He squeezed back just as fiercely, his palms slick with sweat and lake water. They turned to face the encroaching horrors, standing side by side like they had 1,000 times before. Only this time, there would be no miraculous rescue, no class-second reprieve. This was the end of the road, the final chapter in their young lives. The Wendigos closed in, their movements almost lazy now, as if they could sense the resignation in their prey. Sophie met the soulless gaze of the nearest creature, forcing herself to hold its empty stare. This is how it ends, she thought, a twisted sort of calm settling over her. At least we're together. The first Wendigo opened its maw wide, revealing a gullet filled with rows of dagger-like fangs, dripping with viscous strands of saliva and gods knew what else. It took one lurching step forward, unchinging its jaw impossibly wide, like a serpent preparing to swallow its meal whole. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, leaning into Ethan's solid warmth beside her. She felt him trembling, heard the ragged gasps that were his final, futile breaths. Then the Wendigo struck, and the world dissolved into pain and darkness and screams that were abruptly, mercifully silenced. 3 days later, a group of hikers stumbled across the grisly remains of the lakeside cabin. Police and search teams swarmed to the scene, meticulously gathering what little evidence they could find. The cabin itself was a blood-soaked ruin, nearly unrecognizable in the tangle of shredded furniture and rubble. Drag marks and smears of vital fluid told a nightmarish story of violence and savagery that defied rational explanation. In the woods nearby, they found more carnage: the body of a young woman, her throat torn out in a frenzy of brutality, A trail of blood and disturbed foliage suggested a desperate, futile flight from whatever had attacked and killed her. But of the others, there was no sign, no trace to indicate what had become of them. Just a scattering of tattered clothing scraps on the rocky lake shore, soaked in blood and water, as if the victims had met their end in the inky depths. Search parties scoured the woods and lakefront for weeks, deploying every resource at their disposal. Cadaver dogs sniffed fruitlessly for any hint of bodies or graves. Dive teams dredged the murky bottom of Willow Lake inch by inch, but came up empty-handed. In the end, the case went cold, just another entry in the thick ledger of unexplained disappearances and unsolved mysteries that haunted this remote corner of woodland. The case files were archived, left to gather dust while the victims' families were left to grieve without answers or closure. Decades passed, and the details faded from all but the oldest locals' memories. Plenty of wild theories abounded, of course satanic cults, serial killers, even run-ins with territorial bears or packs of feral dogs gone rogue. But the old-timers, the ones whose roots ran deepest in this loam and whose veins carried the blood memories of ancestors who had stalked these woods long before the white settlers came, they knew the truth. They could read the signs, could sense the lingering miasma of dread and malice that still clung to the trees and waters like a spectral shroud. They muttered of dark legends, of the old spirits who had dwelt here since time immemorial, the Wendigos, the flesh renders, the undying hunger given form. And on the nights when the moon hung full and heavy in the sky, they would bar their doors and windows tight, repeating the old words in hushed, fearful whispers, for they knew that the ancient evil still prowled these woods, deathless and insatiable, forever seeking new prey to sate its endless hunger. They knew that no one was truly safe at Willow Lake, where the Wendigos ruled as the eternal, undying monarchs of their grim, blood-soaked domain. The old man's tale ended abruptly, the silence that followed heavy and oppressive. The journalist found herself clutching her notepad so tightly that her knuckles shone white, her mouth dry with horrified anticipation. She swallowed hard, willing her voice not to shake. "What happened to them?" she asked in a hushed whisper. "To Sophie and Ethan, I mean. Did you ever find out?" The old man fixed her with a rechumi, haunted gaze, as if he could see decades of nightmares swimming behind her eyes. "We both know the answer to that," he rasped. His voice was little more than a death rattle, like something left to molder in a forgotten crypt. "The Wendigos claimed them, same as they've claimed countless others over the centuries. What's left of those poor kids is just bones and snippets of torn clothing, scattered and lost to the depths of that black, cursed lake." He shook his head slowly, his face etched in an expression of bone-deep weariness and sorrow. "They never had a chance, those kids. None of them did once the hunger of the Wendigos was roused. It's their way, revel in the hunt, in the delicious terror of their prey, drag it out for as long as they can before finally feasting on the warm flesh, slacking their insatiable thirst for blood and pain, if only for a short while." The journalist shivered involuntarily, her skin prickling with dread despite the warm evening air. She found herself fighting the irrational urge to look over her shoulder, to scan the deepening shadows between the trees for any sign of movement, of the antlered shapes from the old man's grisly narrative. Sensing her disquiet, the aged storyteller chuckled, a dry, grasping sound like scales scraping together. "They're out there, you know," he murmured, a faint smile twisting his cracked lips as he followed her gaze to the gloomy tree line, stalking, watching, forever famished. "They're part of this place, same as the wolves and the bears, as old and lasting as the rocks and the trees themselves." He leaned forward then, his pale eyes boring into hers with unsettling intensity. "Tread carefully on your way out of these woods, Missy," he warned, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "And for your own sake, steer well clear of Willow Lake after nightfall. Those hungry spirits don't take kindly to uninvited guests in their domain." With a final nod and a rattling intake of breath, he leaned back in his rickety chair, seemingly content to let the weight of his tale hang heavy in the twilight air. The journalist mumbled her thanks, suddenly anxious to be away from this place, to put miles between herself and the primordial darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe in the shadowed valleys and hillsides around her. She hurried to her car, the crunch of gravel under her boots seeming to echo unnaturally loud in the stillness. As she yanked open the door and slid behind the wheel, she could have sworn she caught a flicker of movement through the trees, a suggestion of figures shambling between the tangled boughs and reaching branches. Shaking her head as if to dislodge the image, She twisted the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life with a reassuring growl. She threw the car into gear and tore away from the cabin, leaving the old man and his terrible stories behind her. But no matter how many miles she put between herself and Willow Lake, she couldn't quite chase away the lingering sense of dread, the gnawing certainty that something ancient and malevolent watched her departure from the depths of the forest, cold, inhuman eyes burning with insatiable hunger. As the last golden rays of dusk faded to inky blackness, winding tendrils of mist began to coil from the undergrowth and slither across the lonely stretch of dirt road, obscuring her rearview mirror in a veil of spectral white. And just for a moment, before the fog swallowed it up completely, she thought she glimpsed a pair of towering, antlered silhouettes amidst the gnarled shapes of the trees, black and immense against the leaden-gray sky. Then they were gone, and she was alone on the abandoned Buck Road, the night closing in around her like a smothering shroud. Her foot pressed down on the accelerator a little harder, her white knuckles gripping the wheel as she fled from whatever nightmares might lurk in the darkness behind her. But in her mind's eye, she could still see them, the Wendigos, stalking the primordial wilderness in their perpetual, endless hunt. Timeless, deathless, their insatiable hunger spanning the eons, renewed with each fresh kill, each new draft of hot blood and succulent flesh to fuel their cursed existence. Forever waiting, forever watching, the undying monarchs of their savage domain, until the next hapless soul strayed too near the shores of Willow Lake, and the ancient cycle began anew. He settled back in his chair, his eyes growing distant as he began to speak, his words painting a vivid picture of a nightmare come to life.